Adults with learning disabilities and their families are demanding more choice when it comes to their care and accommodation. Some say the professionals who are meant to help them are not taking their concerns seriously enough. I'm journalist Angela Walker, and in this podcast I talk to inspirational people and discuss underreported issues. Today my guest is Ron Brown from the charity Our Life, Our Choice. Thanks for joining us, Ron. First of all, tell me about Our Life, Our Choice. Tell us about this organisation.
Hi, Angela. Thank you for having me on. It's a small independent charity, campaigning charity. It's grown organically, really. The founders or drivers behind it were co-chairs of a charity that was called ResCare, which focused on families. Anita Bennett and Dr. Katie Booth noticed that they were having contacts with families who were finding that what we might call village settings were coming under threat of closure, and in fact the residents who had lived there for many years, in some cases decades, were effectively being presented with no-win options where they would have to leave. They were effectively forced evictions, and that obviously caused consternation. Once this was an obvious pattern, they were insightful enough to start to focus on that, and from that, effectively, Our Life, Our Choice was born. I'm so privileged to be involved. There's just people on there that are just unbelievably talented, unbelievably committed to people with a learning disability, working age adults with a learning disability getting a fair shake, really.
Let's talk about these villages that you mentioned. What exactly are they, and how do they benefit adults with learning disabilities?
Well, there's been some confusion about different terms. So villages, congruent settings, intentional communities, shared lives, shared living. There's kind of not been a clear-sighted view of the differences between them, what they each individually mean. But what we mean by villages are places where people live, where they live in a way that they share an environment. They would have separate accommodation, usually in small group home type arrangements. It's important to remember that there'll be good villages as well as bad villages. That's about the care that's supplied, and that's a sensible and sound judgment. But to say per se that these individual villages are bad, we take issue with that, and we take issue with that for a number of reasons. Those villages might supply some activities, some work, some socialising events, but also, obviously, if they're run well, should reach into the community.
What is the impact on a person who's been living happily in one of these village situations if that shuts down and they have to move?
Well, how I'd answer that, Angela, I'm not sure how long you've lived in your house, but suppose I told you you had to move. You couldn't see any of the people you've been living with necessarily, but that was a possibility, and that you would go maybe many miles away, and that it would disrupt your whole life, your social life, your work life, your people you've been in contact with. Many people who you loved, you may never see again. What impact would that have? Now, on top of that, add an intellectual impairment, a learning disability, and inevitably you would have to process emotions, difficulties. I mean, it would just be horrendous, wouldn't it? It would just be horrendous.
Well, we know that moving house for any of us can be one of the most stressful things. So if it's against someone's will, we can only imagine. And the CQC says human rights and people's needs and preferences are at the heart of our registration decisions and inspection judgments. Human rights and people's needs are the heart. Do you think that's right?
Listen, I think they believe that's right. I think it's probably right. I mean, there's a lot in right support, right care, right culture that I think is commendable, is fantastic. Like I say, I just think they've made certainly. So let's look at different levels.
But I
On the
mean,
simplistic level,
that's the theory of it, isn't it? They're saying that human rights and people's needs and
that's the theory.
preferences are at the heart of what they do. But is that what we're seeing in practice?
Well, I would say there's certainly a case to answer in terms of villages. I think there's certainly a case to answer in terms of increasing the menu of choices. And I would say there's certainly a case to answer in that particular document um, around outcomes. I quite agree with what they're saying, but I think the implementation of it, and there's some structural reasons why it won't be implemented unless there's uh, specific changes, certainly to some of the guidance in the document. But the I just think they've got it wrong on the evidence with villages. I just think they've conflated very challenging, inhumane environments with village life. Some villages are good, some villages are bad. If the village is not providing good care, usually a change of personnel and leadership sorts that out. It seems very, very drastic to use that as an opportunity to close a village, really.
Is it like supported communal living for adults with learning disabilities? Is that the kind of setting that you're talking about?
Their historical roots tend to be that parents have started them when they haven't had any other options, and they've developed and evolved certainly the better ones, where they provide care options for people who really can't find very good care options elsewhere. We're not talking about everyone of working age learning disability this being suitable for, but for certainly for a small number who are highly vulnerable, maybe even highly challenging. They offer a really good option for some families some of the time, and it's in our view, it's probably incorrect to take a view that they are an option that families and people with a learning disability of working age shouldn't have. Certainly people who live there now and have lived there for decades, it's cruel to forcibly evict them.
So, what problems are people with learning disabilities facing when it comes to accommodation? And we're talking about adults with learning disabilities, aren't we?
The issues with learning with accommodation in relation to people with learning disabilities who have eligible care needs, who have needs, particularly higher level needs, who are more vulnerable, is that accommodation very often is linked to care. It's difficult to consider one without the other. We know that the regulator would not register a village type offer now. We know that there's a bit of a pincer movement taking place, so that the CQC's attitude, that's the regulator, and the attitude of many commissioners in local authorities is such that for some, we've conducted freedom of information requests. For some, commissioners wouldn't consider placing someone in a village setting, even if they agreed that was suitable for their needs. Other commissioners not quite as hardcore as that. There's also a ratchet effect, because as is inevitable, any care facility, care accommodation with long term, which has been going long term, will go through peaks and troughs. Sometimes there'll be good leadership, sometimes there'll be not so good leadership. When there's not so good leadership and the care dips, then it's very easy to say, well, that's a village, that's why the care's dipped. That's entirely untrue. The difference between a good care facility and a bad care facility in a village is the same as any other care facility. It's about whether the leadership's in place, can put the right culture in place, the right staff in to deliver. So our best guess is that we maybe lost 40 villages over the last 20 years. And we also know that their new ones are not being registered, even if parents want them registered. We also know they're very, very popular with parents who have them. They're very popular with service users. You know, literally, what would it be like if you lived somewhere for 30 or 40 years, were quite happy, and then were told that you had to leave? The only justification for it would be if there's an evidence base. You know, I'm a great believer in evidence-based practice. If there's an evidence base which says, you know, villages are inherently bad, well, actually, we've met CQC on 2 or 3 occasions, and we've asked them, can they share the evidence with us? What we think has happened is that there has been a kind of conflation of 2 or 3 different concepts, which has meant that villages are perceived in an entirely negative light, really. We know that a number of working age adults with learning disabilities, where their behaviours are, to kind of coin the jargon, challenging, that they have been in assessment and treatment units, that they're not something we would support. We would agree they are congruent settings. We've got about 2,000 people in this country in those settings. They've not committed any crime. They're in secure accommodation, and some of them very, very sadly for many years, and they haven't got options to move on. Villages are not like that. Villages are not that, and there's been a conflation, in our view, of those two concepts.
I mean, it stands to reason that if someone who is susceptible to challenging behaviour is in a living situation where they're not happy, that their behaviour could become erratic. What reason is being given then for shutting down these villages, and where then are the residents being moved to?
We've met the regulator. We've given them the opportunity to share the evidence with us. No evidence has been produced to justify this position. And I have seen for myself, for instance, I once had responsibility for quite a large village, not directly. The person running it, who was very good, reported to me, and there was a house there for people with very challenging behaviour, and it got an outstanding award by CQC. You know, that there was an inspector who looked at it, who was professionally very grounded, knew the subject area, and recognised the outcomes were outstanding. So there's at least a contest about the evidence base, but it's not been shared with us.
In the CQC document that I've got here, right support, right care, right culture, they say for people with a learning disability and behaviour that may challenge, NICE guidance recommends people should have the option to live alone with appropriate support if they prefer this and it's suitable for them. If adults prefer not to live alone with support, or it's not suitable for them, offer them the option of living with a small number of people in shared housing that has a small scale domestic feel. Involve people in choosing how many people and who they live with. But then it does go on to say, while we continue to refer to NICE guidance in describing what small means, for how we apply our approach, we want to be clear this is not the same as having an upper limit for the size of services. So they're saying that people should be given the option of living in a smaller, more like house type setting. Is that the kind of thing that you are campaigning for, Ron?
No, not really. I wouldn't have a problem with what they've said there. If you notice, that's linked specifically to people who might have challenging behaviour. That's, you know, that's fair enough. Our view is about choice. It's not about a restricting choice, really, unless there's evidence which says one type of provision is problematic in itself. So we want choice. We obviously, if people want to live like that and it's good for them, then that's great. There's no problem at all with that. What I would push back on is slightly this narrative that, you know, everyone with a learning disability of working age will be able to live somehow in their own independent flat or you know, small accommodation in the community. I've worked in the community. a lot of the time they're not free choices. People are vulnerable. The cuckooing that takes place in urban areas is you know is a real problem. Local criminals, usually drug dealers, might target someone with a learning disability who lives on their own, might receive some level of care and support, and they'll use that facility as a base for their criminal activities, and also that the treatment of the learning disabled person, who might at first view these people as friends, is appalling. The idea that people with a learning disability are not often living very isolated, very vulnerable, very lonely lives is quite different to the narrative that's presented. Also, what I would say to you is that in supported living examples, which I think is what that's alluded to, what we'd call supported living, one of the issues with that is I've seen tenancy agreements where they've been signed with a cross. I've seen tenancy agreements where people agree for the person with a learning disability. And I've certainly seen a number of people with a learning disability who have tenancy agreements who would have no idea what a tenancy agreement is, what that tenancy agreement means. And again, I'm not against that. I think it's a great thing for the vast majority of people with the right support that will work well. But there are people, two categories. One, where they've lived on a village for a very long time, 10 years or more. Very different to emptying what used to be called the old style psyche bins, which were appalling, were terrible. I've seen people moved out of those and they've done very well, particularly where they've moved into housing in the community with the staff that they were used to over the years. That was a brave thing to do and the right thing to do. Closing of these villages by this kind of ratchet effect and pincer movement is not the right thing to do. It's not the right thing to do for people who live there, and it's not the right thing to do as an option for new people who might join there. I worked for an organisation, and one of the things that struck me, it did have a village, and over the years the village had good reputation, bad reputation, depending on the leadership in place and the quality of care provided over time. What struck me was, in my time, which I found increasingly difficult, I was the director of care there, and I turned down 14 families who would have been ideal for that village. 14 who then went off and got effectively substandard care. It ought to be a matter of choice. So what we want to do at our choice, we want to for villages to be treated fairly that exist. We want what I would call the care environment to be judged. Is it suitable? Is it suitable for the outcomes that are being claimed? And is it something that, frankly, parents and families and the people with learning disabilities themselves, they are all supportive of? And if you've got 95% of people at a facility that are supportive of it, that are leading great lives, there's great outcomes, it really beggars belief that new initiatives that might do the same are automatically off the table.
Tell me more about the ResCare petition.
Shall I read you it? It's very short. Shall I read you it? Okay. So we call on the CQC to amend their current guidelines so that all people with learning disabilities and or autism have the same fundamental human right to choose where they live and receive care according to their individually assessed needs, as does everyone else. Well-managed and regulated group and village communities should be considered equally alongside small urban and rural residential living, supported living and independent living. So we want to expand choice, and we want the nature, we've got the nature of the sector or market to be determined by the people who use it rather than to be overly prescribed top down.
So tell me, Ron, what happens in a family situation where there's an adult child and they're looking for somewhere suitable to live? You're saying that there's not really a great deal of choice. What's the process? What are the options available to somebody like that?
The first port of call would be an assessment of eligibility. So they'll apply to their local council. Probably they're already known as a child. They'd apply, there'd be an eligibility criteria. They would then be judged to be eligible on a scale, very high needs, medium needs, low needs, and then at that point, having received their eligibility, um, they would get a determination which the family would the person with the learning disability, if they had full capacity, would sign off, and if not, if someone had legal rights or parent would kind of sign it off as accepting that determination. Of course, the reality is the end point. The getting those needs met in a way that is suitable for the person with a learning disability, for the family, is about having different options available, really. Because the reality is, if the sector's driving homogeneity, it doesn't really matter what you would prefer. You'll be stuck with the homogeneity.
So, in that situation, say the person's had their needs assessed and they are eligible, what options would typically be presented to them?
Well, I guess there's a diminishing menu. That there's a kind of, I would say, unstated preference in local authorities for what we call supported living in the community, which is what we talked about earlier. There's a number of reasons for that. One, narrative. Two, the stuff you've read from CQC earlier, but also how budgets operate. So it's one of the things we'd like as a campaign is for real costs to be looked at. Transaction costs. One of the incentives for a local authority to push certain types of care is that one type of care, supported living in the community, in a small setting, isn't fully funded by the local authority. Some of it's met as housing need, and that housing need, basically the local authority claims and passports out, so it doesn't hit their budgets. I mean, the bottom line is that there's a way that individual budget holders can defray costs of care. We've already spoken how accommodation and care is linked effectively for a lot of these people. They can defray costs on hits to their budget by effectively having outcomes which prefer a certain type of care. Now, that's a perverse incentive, it seems to me, contrary to meeting eligible need. But also, I think, in terms of value for the taxpayer, it's a mistake, because let's say, for example, in well run care, unplanned calls on health service, emergency situations, certainly admissions to very very rigid regimes like the assessment and treatment units, would be diminished.
We know that if people are happy, they're more likely to stay well for longer, aren't they?
Going back to the people that challenge type situations, what often will happen in those situations, if they have inadequate care, the end of their care journey is in a highly restricted environment that they're usually admitted to on a short term for an assessment, but in reality many of them don't get out for years and years and years, if at all. Can I just read you one thing from someone who signed our petition, and it really did strike me, this. I won't say her name, but if people visit our petition, they'll see. My son has autism spectrum disorder and has already been through the stress of being uprooted once from his care home. It brings huge stress to families in having to find another placement. Freedom of choice is vital. without over prescriptive parameters. And I think that sums up where we're at, really. And that's what we hear from parents all the time, and families, and people with learning disability themselves.
Why do you think people with learning disabilities and their families are not being heard when they're asking for this choice?
I think there's a number of reasons. We've talked about the pincer movement, the ratchet effect. If one looks at stakeholders, just analyses stakeholders, powerful stakeholders, professionals, their professional associations, I would say certainly large corporates, uh, private equity funds. I'm not against um, uh, private supply, by the way, but far from it. I think it does wonderful things at times. But it's clear that in any analysis of stakeholders, families, and people with a learning disability themselves, despite whatever rhetoric, despite whatever jargon is used, it's obvious that their power, if you like, their ability to influence is much less than other stakeholders, and that can't be right, really.
Are you saying, Ron, that the client, if you will, um, the needs of the client are not being met because the needs of the other stakeholders are taking priority?
I think that's worth looking at. I don't think that's the only thing. I mean, there's obviously, where accommodation is concerned, there's huge barriers to entry to the market. I
Well,
would
let me
certainly.
let me put it this way. Surely, in this situation, when we're talking about housing for adults with a learning disability, their needs and preferences should be number one, the top consideration. It should trump everything else because we're talking about their health and well-being. Do you think that patients, clients, however you would like to think of them, adults with learning disabilities who need housing, do you think that they are being treated as the priority in this system for housing?
I would say not, but I would add one proviso to what you're saying. I think it's fair and reasonable to restrict choice where we know evidentially that that particular choice is actively harmful or dangerous. And also, I'd add another caveat, and that would be around safety. So I think it's fair and proportionate and reasonable. But outside of that, I do think empowering people with a learning disability of working age, their families, and also, by the way, natural communities and their communities, empowering them to come up with their own solutions that they choose. That's entirely different to funding, which we've talked about in terms of the assessment. Of course, eligibility and funding is a matter for the state. That's determined by whoever takes a view of what we as a society regard as eligible, regard as fair for funding. After that, yes, I do think that people with a learning disability, their families and communities should be much more significant stakeholders than they are.
How much of an impact do you think suitable accommodation can have on the overall well-being and lifestyle of an adult who's got some learning disabilities?
Let's look at the ATUs that we mentioned. 2,000 people in this country are
So
being
remind us what
out.
ATU is for the
Sorry,
listener.
they're assessment and treatment units. So they're usually some level of secure accommodation where over 2,000 people in this country are detained without any having committed no crime, without any real prospect of leaving, and many of them. And I think if we opened up the sector and the market to more innovation, more creativity, was more choice led, I think we'd empty those.
Wow, so you think that people are being kept against their will, would you say?
Well,
It
there are as often with these things, there are legal processes in place which would lead you to believe that it's in those people's best interest to be kept there. But of course, you can't divorce that from what realistic options are available. And with realistic options, with a sector or market that was incentivized for creativity, innovation, choice, I have no doubt in my mind, having worked in the sector for well over 30, I'm admitting to 30, but it's a bit more than that, years, that they would be emptied. And they would be emptied for better care environments. And if you want my honest opinion, I think the value to the taxpayer would be higher.
So do you think that people are being kept in secure units, some of them unnecessarily, when they might be better suited to some kind of like independent living accommodation for financial reasons?
No, I wouldn't say independent living accommodation. I wouldn't use that term. But if other care options were available, would they be better placed at better value for the taxpayer? Yes, they would. And you wouldn't have to go. You wouldn't have to go very far, Angela, to find families whose adult children were in those environments where the families had, incredibly difficult time, where people were admitted ostensibly for a short term, and many years later are still there.
Gosh, I will have to catch up with some of those families. I'd really like to talk to them. How can people get their voices heard then, Ron?
I would ask people to look at sign our petition. I would ask people to visit our website. I would ask people to look out for stuff. We've got a conference coming up in April where that's an opportunity. Please encourage your political representatives to go. This is one of the great injustices of our age. So the website address is ourlifeourchoice.co.uk.
Perfect. Well, Ron, thank you so much for coming on and telling us about your campaign. I look forward to hearing about the conference as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angela. I really appreciate the opportunity. So good of you. So grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome. You've been listening to Angela Walker in Conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed the show. Please do share it with other people who might be interested. And you can find more stories like this and more podcasts on my website, angelawalkerreports.com. Until next time, take care.